All right, so we're looking at statistics, and the approach that we're taking will be looking at the organization and presentation of data. To begin with, we want to talk about types of data. We have two types of data that we need to be familiar with when we do our studies of statistics, and these include discrete data and continuous data. Now, discrete data is any type of data that you could take individual or separate values among. This is usually items that can be counted with whole number values, right? You cannot have fractions or decimals in this type of data, right? So, for example, the number of students in a class, or maybe the number of cars in a parking lot, number of goals scored in a football match. These are all countable items, and we refer to them as being discrete. They have individual values and no range of values, right? So they are all countable items, right? You wouldn't say that you have 3.5 people in a class, so you wouldn't say that there's 216 car in a parking lot. They have to assume whole number of values. The other type of data is continuous data. Continuous data could take values or within any particular range. These are usually measurements, so they could include fractions or decimals. So if in that same classroom, we're talking about the height or the weight of the students in the classroom, these values could take on fractions or decimals. Somebody could be 165.5 centimeters tall, or they could be 70.2 kgs, right? Other examples could be things like time, temperature. These are usually values that we could measure on some sort of scale. So we have continuous versus discrete data. Now, in our studies of statistics here for CSEC Math, we're also going to be dealing with two types of data in terms of the weights presented. We have what we call ungrouped data and group data. Now, ungrouped data is raw data where each individual value is recorded separately. So if, for example, we have a class of 20 students and we are recording the marks that they scored in our math test, we could use ungrouped data, right? We will have the student name, A, B, C, D, and we could record the score that they get out of 10. This is useful for small data sets, 20 people in a classroom. That's manageable. But then if it starts to get too voluminous, meaning that we have too much data to organize, like if for example, we're looking at the CSEC marks that students get in the Caribbean, that might be too difficult or it will be too cumbersome for us to record using ungrouped data. So then we will start to arrange the data into classes or intervals. This makes it more easier to analyze. So you might look at students that scored 75% and above, or maybe 60 to 74, and students that score between 50 to 59, right? Large data sets are much easier to work when we have group data. Another example could be, let's say, in a hospital, they're taking the weights of newborn babies for the entire ward or in a month, right? These values could vary. And then it's continuous data as well, too. So a baby could be anywhere 5 pounds, 5 ounces, 6 pounds, 6 ounces, 4 pounds, 3 ounces. We could have a whole range. So maybe what would make more sense to capture that information would be to set different intervals. We call these groups intervals or classes. And this makes it much easier to analyze the data, right? So let's say we're thinking about the number of students. You could go back with the same score. People scoring between 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14 in the entire school, right? We could say, well, there are 3 students that scored between 0 to 4, 5 students that score between 5 to 9, or 7 students that score between 10 to 14, right? This makes it a lot easier when we're working with large data sets. So I have some questions based on what we just discussed that I'd like you to look at, and then we will look at the solutions to them. Identify whether the following are discrete or continuous. We have number of pencils in our box, mass of apples in our basket, number of books on our shelf, time taken to complete a test. So you will just write the phrase and you'll write discrete or continuous next day. Question 2 says to decide whether the following data is grouped or ungrouped. Scores of 5 students, number of hours studied by 100 students presented in intervals of 0 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 15. And give an example of discrete data and continuous data from your classroom or from your home. All right. So identify discrete or continuous number of pencils in our box. We could count that individually. You wouldn't have 0.5 of a pencil or half a pencil as this discrete. Mass of apples in our basket. That'll be example of continuous because this is something that we can measure on a scale. Number of books on a shelf, that's discrete. We could count that individually. They're countable. Time taken to complete a test, that's going to be continuous. Right? Grouped or ungrouped. Scores of students. This is an example of ungrouped. Number of hours studied by students. This is an example of group. And it's evident because we have the use of intervals, class intervals. An example of discrete data. This might be the number of people at a concert. Right, this is discrete. And continuous might be the speed of cars crossing an intersection. All right, so that's all that we need to cover in terms of discrete continuous data, group data, and ungrouped data.